In 2003, Airfix were in gear to celebrate 50 years of producing model plane kits, and to mark the occasion, they released a special anniversary kit. A re-release of the first ever Airfix plane, the Supermarine Spitfire. However, Airfix had actually gotten the date wrong. Whilst they had indeed first started making injection moulded model kits in 1953, their first release was a model of Sir Francis Drake's world circumnavigating ship, the Golden Hind. The Spitfire kit was not released until 1955, however due to an error in Airfix's own records, they had been led to believe it was from 1953. Thus, Airfix's 50 Years of Aviation Models kit was released for Airfix's 48th year of plane model kit production, not their 50th. So, in the same spirit, I am going to build this special set to mark 68 years of the Airfix Spitfire. Nice. I purchased this kit off a nice couple on eBay, who almost certainly put way more care and attention into packing up the kit than they ever needed to. All the sprues, which would normally be loose in the box along with any other parts, were lovingly bubble wrapped and wrapped in paper for shipping, and the entire kit came wrapped and boxed up in the mail very neatly. Thanks JK Titch on eBay, go check them out. Inside the box, I found a little bag containing 2 blue sprues capped with a 1950s style header, a large bag containing a massive sprue of parts, 4 enamel paint tins, a brush, a tube of polycement, and a bag containing instructions and decals. Having assessed that everything was present and correct, I began construction. This little kit, in 1:72 scale, is not actually based on the original tooling from 1955. The original was first produced in 1:48 scale by Aurora Models before the tooling was scaled down to 1:72 by Airfix for sale in little plastic bags. Once better toolings were created, the original tools were either lost or destroyed, so this recreation uses tooling from some point in the 1970s instead, which has slightly more detail and is constructed in a different way to the original. I chose not to paint it, to let the beautiful plastic show its colours as an identifier of its heritage.
Why did they make this so big? It's bigger than the model. Like, why is the base so big? Who knows?
This kit was a very nice and simple thing to build. It had a few problems, one being that the canopy had short-shotted in the mould and was missing a chunk, and I also lost the landing light after it pinged off whilst cutting it from the sprue. Nobody's going to be looking at the underside though, so nobody really care. Building a model without paint is actually quite a liberating experience, as normally that takes up most of my time when I make these models. And with that, enjoy these beach shots, and I bid you farewell. Hey, wait a minute, no! This isn't the end of the video. I've got a whole lot of models to build yet. Don't go away, you fuck. This is the meat and potatoes of the video here. An F-22 Spitfire in 1:48 scale, the most recent Airfix Spitfire release at the time, tooled in 1996 and also able to build as an F-24 Spitfire. This is the first time I've ever worked in this scale, so it was a very novel experience and a nice new challenge for me after a year of wallowing about in 1:72 scale. Let's see how that went.
So, here we are at the sink, and as you might expect, we're going to clean the part because There's a load of probably 20-something-year-old molding grease that we gotta sort out here. That's not going to be nice when putting them all together. However, something I realised is that people often don't just dunk it in here, they use a toothbrush because, you know, that's actually quite useful to get in all the nooks and crannies. However, normal toothbrush, that's for old people or something, and people who don't take care of their dental hygiene. So what I did was I got a old crappy, very well used brush, electric brush head, and I'm going to use that instead. If you're wondering why my arms look so shiny, it's because I take good care of my skin, okay? I definitely didn't spend 4 hours on a walk in the sun without sun lotion and got sunburned. That's not what happened, I swear that's not what happened.
Before building this model, I had spent quite some time acquiring paints for the kit, as the paint scheme was very complex and required many colours that I did not have. Specifically, 19, 24, 33, 53, 56, 61, 69, 71, 78, 85, 90, 96, 98, 106, 135, 163, 165, 171, 1321, 1322, and 1325. Now, I know that sounds bad, but it's pretty normal for big models like these with lots of intricate detail. Once I had these paints, I got to construction. The cockpit had a nice amount of detail and was quite easy to construct. The pilot figure was nicely detailed, though I had to spend some time sanding down mould seams around the sides. With some paints, they turned out pretty sharp. I chose to dry brush silver and white paint mixture onto the dashboard instead of applying the decal, because for one, the decal didn't match the moulded detail shapes on the part, and two, my Humbrol decal fix was not strong enough to properly melt into the detail anyway, and three, the decal practically disintegrated as I was moving it around, so I elected not to apply it for fear of it looking bad. I mean, no one's going to see it anyway because it's inside the cockpit, but personally I think the dry brushing looked better anyway. I painted the cockpit in, predictably, number 78 cockpit green, and stuck everything in. It wasn't totally aligned perfectly, but it looks alright from a distance. It was a bit of a fiddle getting the pilot in, but I did it eventually. I glued the back half of the fuselage together, then slid in the back of the spinner before sealing off the rest. I had a bit of a calamity when I pushed the spinner axle through the base plate, but managed to push it back in through the back with the end of the paintbrush, and secured it in place with some more polycement. That was a close one. I initially painted the inside of the wings in black, but then repainted in green when I realised that that was what was in the instructions, and I am a sucker for following instructions. I painted the wheel wells in number 56 aluminium following a base coat of black to make sure it stuck. I'm not quite sure about the accuracy of these wells because on other Spitfires I've built the wells follow the shape of the hole the gear goes into, but on this model they're just squares. Not sure if this is correct or just lazy tooling. If you know the answer, please do comment below. The navigation lights on the bottom, or whatever they are, necessitated clear paint for the clear parts, but since Humbrol discontinued their few clear paint colours, I had to get some via dipping my toes into Vallejo's catalogue. I think it turned out surprisingly well. I also drilled out a few holes for attaching the optional rockets you voted for, all 9 of you, and then once that was done, I slid the wing, with much bending and fettling, into place. There were some somewhat egregious panel gaps around the wing as well as seam lines where the fuselage halves had been joined together. This necessitated applying lots of model filler, sanding down with 600, 1000 and something around 2000 grit sandpaper, then painting with prime to check for any blemishes that were still there. When they invariably were there, I sanded it down again, applied more filler and then repeated the process. After quite a lot of time and a significant hit to my lung health, I was finally satisfied with the finish, though I then had to rescore the panel lines that had been filled in or sanded down by all of my overly perfectionist sanding work. After some research, I determined that I needed to install the landing flaps raised, as I was building the kit as a stationary piece on the ground, and apparently the flap's resting position is raised instead of hanging down. After sticking these in, I tried using some model fillers and poly cement to smooth out the gaps, but unfortunately the flaps ended up rather deformed. Oops. Thankfully, people don't usually look at the underside of the model when it's sitting down, so no one will really care. Apart from everyone that watches this video, that is. Sorry. Having applied a couple more small parts, I had finished the main body construction and could move on to painting.
Oh, shit.
I masked off the canopy for painting and had applied a base coat of cockpit green to act as an interior colour. I first decided to focus on the underside, which I painted in number 165 medium sea grey. This took a couple coats, probably too many, but eventually I got a finish that I was satisfied with. Before I applied the final coat, I used a 4B pencil to highlight some of the panel lines, which gives a slightly pre-shaded look and adds some nice extra detail to the model. Thanks, Quick Kits. After masking off the underside to protect it, I painted the top of the fuselage in number 164 dark sea grey. I should have used number 106 ocean grey, but I neglected to put that on my list and thus forgot to buy it. Thankfully, the two colours are fairly similar, so only the most scrupulous of modelers will take umbrage with it, hopefully. There was a bit of a disaster where I accidentally used number 123 extra dark sea grey by mistake and ended up making the entire thing way darker, which forced me to sand down the model to remove the top layer before repainting in the correct colour, and I ended up sanding down the model a couple more times and repainting some areas for a better and less streaky finish. It's not my finest work, but it looks so good from a distance, so I'd say I've succeeded. Following this, I began painting the camo pattern. I did this with number 163 dark green, painting freehand whilst referencing the paint diagrams and the instructions. I made a mistake at one point and overpainted, but I managed to catch it before it set and wiped it off with a cotton bud with a little bit of acrylic thinner on it. I touched it up with a bit of grey before fixing the camo. The final finish I think turned out pretty nice for a brush painting, and having touched up some of the chips and paint bleeding, I could start applying decals. First, I had to apply a number of decals common to multiple or all of the three paint schemes offered. These mostly turned out alright, however there were a few which were annoyingly misaligned. Early on in the process, I suffered a disaster where I found out I had placed the black footplate decals in the wrong place. I was forced to repaint the footplates in the correct locations, which took some time and a lot of fiddly masking. I tried to apply the supplied decal for the band around the tail, but I couldn't get it on right, so I chose to paint it on instead. I added the roundels and the side demarcations next, which went on very well and I found quite easy to apply. The red part of the roundels was separate so they would appear more vibrant when applied, as the decals were not quite opaque and would have made the red appear darker if there was no white underneath. The reds were annoyingly somewhat bleached to a more brownish orange colour after leaving them out in the sun for 3 weeks, so they weren't exactly realistic, but from a distance they don't look too bad, so I think I'll get away with it. As to exactly why they were left out in the sun for 3 weeks, it was because the backing film was rather yellowed, and I had learned from a YouTube video that leaving them in the sun could unyellow them. I believe it was Greg's Models which taught me that. I also had to add some yellow highlights onto the leading edges of the wings, which were on the skis. My mother told me they looked very smart. The paint, after having had to touch up a number of imperfections and also coated in decal fix, was looking a bit musty, so I added a layer of satin varnish over the top, which nicely evened it out for the most part. I attempted to accentuate the panel lines with a black enamel wash, as they were looking a bit flat, but I was wary that I might damage my beautiful paintwork by causing the paint to react with the very alcoholic smelling enamel thinners, so I decided to run a test on this Spitfire here, the first model I ever made in this series almost a year ago. It's not a good model. I built it horribly and that video is bad, don't watch it. Thankfully, my low view of this first model means I have absolutely no qualms about using, or abusing it as a testbed for new techniques. I applied a bit of the wash, and it mostly didn't seem to react, so I went ahead with applying a bit about the wings. In the end, it didn't really show up that much. I was still wary about damaging the paint, and was scared as it seemed to be bubbling up a bit, so I ended up stopping pretty quickly. The bits where it did work, such as around the ailerons, the bits that moved, yes, they turned out pretty well. I added a touch of black weathering dust around the cannons and exhaust for a bit of smoke weathering. Whilst I wanted this model to look quite clean and more like a museum piece, I did want it to have an element of being a bit worn in. As such, I also added a generous but restrained amount of chipping with silver paint on the end of the cocktail stick to the area around the footplate and on the edges of the propeller blades. Remember, Griffin engine Spitfires have props which spin clockwise, so the chips will appear on the right hand side of the propeller, as that is the leading edge onto which things will be hit against it. These chips, quite conveniently, don't just make this plane look more realistic and lived in, they also quite helpfully disguise my shoddy masking job and the uneven sizing of the replacement footplates. So that's nice, I guess. Finally, I added a final layer of matte varnish to seal in the weathering powder and the chipping. However, just as I started testing out the airbrush, I ran out of propellant. Having acquired a new can, I sprayed the entire model with matte varnish to seal in my weathering and tone down the shiny satin slightly. I then decided that I hated this, so I added more satin back on to undo that. It ended up with this sort of slightly textured satin finish, which I wasn't all that big a fan of, but it's not too noticeable, so it's fine. I think I'll stick with just satin in the future. I also added the optional rockets I had bored holes out for earlier, and the pitot tube and antenna on the underside of the wing that might have gotten damaged had I applied them earlier. I used superglue for this instead of polycement as I did not wish to damage my paintwork with highly corrosive acetone on the final step of my build. And having finished that, my build of the Airfix Spitfire F-22 was complete. This kit is beautiful. I know it's obviously not the best model Spitfire in the world, not by a long shot, but it's definitely the best kit I've made so far. For a kit tooled in 1996 and sold in 2003, it has very good detail, and whilst the decals aren't top-notch, at times being misaligned and somewhat crumbly, once on the model they look great. A small amount of the weathering makes the model feel far more realistic, and its large size allows even more detail to be seen in it. Certainly a kit that still holds up to this day. I highly recommend checking it out, as it can still be found at an accessible price on eBay. So, what did I think of this collection as a whole? Well, I'm sure that if one was buying this in 2003, they would have been very satisfied. It comes with two nice little kits, one a throwback to the early days of the model kit company's history, and one from the modern day. Well, 7 years ago from 2003, just to sweeten the deal. Both kits were decently tooled for their time, and even today they're fun to build, with mostly decent fit on the part and not too much flashing. The kit also comes with a few enamel paints which, whilst I did not end up using, I'm sure will be very useful to anyone who did use them. One of my only complaints would be that the plastic was not of particularly good quality. Something I noticed in my video on old Airfix Harriers was that the late 1990s model used a rather thin grey plastic that felt lighter and less pleasant to hold, as well as having a nasty yellow colouring when held up to a light, which this kit unfortunately has too, though less noticeably on the blue one. Of course, this won't be seen once you paint it over the models, which I imagine most people would. And with that, we've finally reached the proper end of this video! Thank you to everyone who supported this series and all my others over the past year. Since I started this series, I've gained nearly 200 subscribers and my videos have gotten better and better. I hope to bring you much more model making, animation and other fun things soon, but until then, it's goodbye from me. Happy 68th anniversary, Airfix!